institutions, and growth. We have three interesting speakers who will each speak for 15 minutes, and then discussants who will discuss for 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And I hope I don't have to echo. So let's get started with Sadi Raz speaking on soil heterogeneity, social learning, and the formation of tight-knit communities. Please take it away.
Sahi, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay. Can you guys hear me now? Yeah? Okay, good. So hi, everyone. Sorry for that. And so I'm very excited to be here and present my work. Too bad I'm not there in person, but I hope next year. Thank you for being here and hearing this. And a big thank you to the organizers for including my paper in the schedule. And a special thank you to Paul, who I think hears this talk now for the third time. So thank you and sorry, Paul. So let me start with a brief introduction. Social learning has been the focus of a very large literature in economics that dates back at least to the famous work of Zvi Grilichis in the late 1950s. Generally speaking, this literature focuses on the process of learning from others, taking culture and social structure as given, rather than seeing it as a potential outcome of social learning. There is also a large interdisciplinary literature across the social sciences on what is often considered to be the most fundamental cultural cleavage across human societies, and that's the difference between cultures in which the social structure is close-knit and those in which it is loose-knit. Recently, there's also an increasing interest in this cultural cleavage in economics, where loose-knit social structure has been associated with a higher innovation and economic development, and also with left-wing political preferences. An interesting part of this literature focuses on understanding the historical deep roots of social structure, highlighting factors such as in-group cooperation, extended key networks, or voluntary settlement. Social learning has been associated in this literature with close-knit social structure, but again, as an outcome, not as a cause. And so in this paper, I studied the impact of social learning on the formation of close-knit communities, focusing on 19th century farmers in the US. So during the settlement of the United States, millions of farmers migrated to new locations that had unfamiliar characteristics. To survive, they had to quickly discover what were the optimal location-specific farming practices that were potentially quite different from what they used to do back home. Broadly speaking, there's two strategies that they could have taken. The first is learning by doing. The second, that has the potential of being quicker and more efficient, is to engage in social learning and to build on the knowledge and the experience of their neighbors. However, substantial heterogeneity of soil and soil characteristics in their area would have limited their ability to do so, because it implies that whatever it is that was optimal for their neighbors might not have been optimal for them. And indeed, according to the historian Shannon, those farmers' inability to learn from their neighbors ended up fostering what he calls their traditional individualism. So the story that Shannon tells us is that farmers try to learn from neighbors or local agricultural societies, but often failed. And so they developed this individualistic psychology saying, it doesn't matter what other people think or do, I'm going to do what I think is right. And, more generally, we might imagine that in an environment where you can potentially learn valuable information through others, the incentives to engage in social interaction and invest in social ties is going to be high. So what do I do in this paper? I provide the first empirical evidence supporting what I call Shannon's social learning hypothesis. First, I establish a negative historical association between soil heterogeneity and close-knit communities. But I also go beyond simply establishing correlation by studying the formation of this association. Focusing on domestic migrants in the 19th century, I first show that this association is not explained by a selection of migrants. And then, using a difference in differences framework, I document the causal impact of soil heterogeneity on farmers' social structure. I also provide suggestive evidence supporting limited social learning of farmers being the key channel that drives this association. Finally, I also document persistence, although I won't be talking about this part of the paper today. So to test Shannon's social learning hypothesis, I construct a novel county-level measure of local soil heterogeneity, which captures the average dissimilarity of soil across neighboring locations in the county. The index is based on detailed georeferenced soil data coming from the digital general soil map of the United States. In the map before you that plots the data, a darker color implies a higher degree of local soil heterogeneity. And so you can see that there's a lot of very interesting variation in the data. Importantly, there's also a lot of variation within states. And you can probably also see that this variation in the degree of local soil heterogeneity is not trivially explained by one single other geoclimatic characteristic. To measure the degree of close-knit social networks in historical data, I build on the seminal contributions in social psychology that points to the centrality of the group identity in individual self-definition as the key factor that varies between close and loose-knit social structures. And so I proxy close-knit communities with the centrality of the communal identity in individuals' self-definition, which I measure using children's first names. The idea being that in a close-knit community, the local community will be more central in parents' social identity, and this would be reflected in their naming choices. Specifically, what I do is that I follow Fryer and Levitt that developed a black name index to measure names that are distinctively black and reflect a black social identity. A similar measure was recently used by Ron, Leah, and Catherine, and also by Vicky to study assimilation versus holding on to previous national or social identities. But I apply it not across racial or national groups, but rather across space to create a local name index. What the index equals to is essentially the probability that a name is given to a local child relative to a child elsewhere in the country. It varies between 0 and 100, where a high value implies a distinctively local name, and a value of 50 implies that the name is as popular in your local community as it is elsewhere in the country, so there's no information in the name regarding the communal identity. In the paper, I also use two alternative measures, one that is based on religious diversity and one that is based on the strength of family ties, but I won't have time to discuss those today. To give you a sense of the data, I'm plotting the map of the county level local name index as it was in 1940s. A darker color implies a higher tendency of parents to choose names that are distinctively local. So you can see that the spatial patterns that emerge are clearly non-random and kind of match what I think is the perception that most of us have regarding the geography of culture in the US. And that's that the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast are locations in which social networks are more loose-knit, whereas in the South, the Wheat Belt, the location where there's a lot of Mormons, the social structure is more close. Also within states, counties where big cities are located tend to have lower LNIs. In the paper, I also validate the LNI being a meaningful measure of close-knit communities using data on individual versus communal morality coming from NK 2020. Okay, so I start off by studying the historical association between soil heterogeneity and close-knit communities in a simple OLS framework. In this part of the presentation, I won't be making strong claims about causality. I'll get there. The identification assumption here is simply conditional exogeneity, which I test by adding more and more controls and using Oster 2019. So here are the main results. What I find is a robust and significant negative association between soil heterogeneity and a close-knit social structure as measured by the LNI. My preferred specification in column 4 with all of the controls suggests that going from a complete soil homogeneity to a complete soil heterogeneity is associated with about 2.5 points drop in the LNI, which is about 40% of a standard deviation. So far from trivial. This association is highly robust to variations in measurement, specification, and the way you calculate standard errors to do inference and so on. It's also robust to using the two alternative proxy measurement for close-knit social structure that I've mentioned earlier. Okay. So in the causal inference part of the paper, I focus on 19th century migrants within the US to explore both selection and treatment. I use information on children's year and state of birth to identify families that migrated within the country. Here's a simple example. So suppose I observe a family living in Massachusetts in 1850 that has two children. The first was born in 1842 in New York, and the second in 1846 in Massachusetts, and they currently live in Massachusetts. So I'm going to say it looks like this family migrated from New York to Massachusetts sometime between the year of birth of those two children. And so following this procedure, I can construct a sample of families that migrated, proxy the year of migration, and match them with the treatment, which is the degree of local soil heterogeneity at the county of destination. So what do I find? No evidence of selection. However, I do find treatment effect that is associated with, that is consistent with the reduced form evidence. So let's see that. So to study selection, what I do is I restrict the sample of family that migrated within the country to only include children born before their parents' migration. The question I'm asking is there an association between parents' prior level of communal ties or a tendency for communal identification as reflected in the LNI score of their children born before the migration and the degree of soil heterogeneity in the county of destination? I find no significant association, suggesting that the story is not about selection. To estimate the causal impact of a limited scope for social learning, I use a differences framework, studying the naming patterns of children born in families that migrated within the US, arrived to counties that had varying degrees of soil heterogeneity before and after the family moved. Importantly, estimation here is done with a family fixed effect that's going to absorb all of the variation that comes from stuff like parental background, cultural identity, etc. So if you're still worried about selection, that's going to hopefully deal with that. And so I'll focus on showing you two sets of key results. On the right, you can see the result of this exercise estimated on non-farmers' families. Those clearly should not be directly affected by a lack of ability of farmers to engage in social learning. And indeed, there are no differential trends before or after. But on the left, when estimated on farmers' families, I find that the LNI score of children born after their parents moved to a soil heterogeneous location where they could not have learned from their neighbors drops relative to the LNI score of children born to farmers that moved to a location where they could have learned from their neighbors. And the effect really loads on the first few years, the years in which social learning was more central and important, and the years in which new social ties are potentially created. So to me, it makes a lot of sense. And so I think that this time path and also the comparison of the results across farmers or non-farmers are quite striking. Okay, so in the last 2 minutes that I have, I want to quickly mention a few key findings that are suggestive of farmers' social learning being the key channel. First, it really seems like farmers themselves are being affected. I find that soil heterogeneity matters for communal ties, even when I hold the share of farmers fixed, suggesting that the main story is not about differential rates of urbanization or industrialization. But soil heterogeneity does not matter if no one is engaged in agriculture. It matters more the higher the share of farmers is. Second, soil heterogeneity is associated with a higher actual agricultural diversity and with a lower rate of adoption of a new agricultural technology, in this case, fertilizers. Both are consistent with soil heterogeneity, limiting farmers' social learning. Finally, I look directly at two confounding channels. The first is that a higher soil heterogeneity creates agricultural inequality, which matters for the strength of communal ties. And the second is that settlers could have selected into locations based on soil types, looking for soil that was similar to what they knew from back home, so that soil heterogeneity created birthplace diversity, which again matters for the strength of communal ties. So I look at those two things directly, and I find that neither explain the result. Okay, so let me conclude and say that the distinction between close-knit and loose-knit social structure is often considered to be the fundamental cultural cleavage across human societies globally. What I do in this paper is provide the first empirical evidence supporting the social learning hypothesis that was put forth by the historian Fred Shannon 75 years ago, but received little to no attention since, and that's despite a substantial literature on those issues across the social sciences. And what the finding of this paper suggests is that while understudied, social learning might be an important factor in the formation of close-knit communities. So that's it. Thank you, and I look forward for the discussion and questions and comments.
Thanks so much. We now have Testa from Tulane providing commentary for 10 minutes, and then we open it up to questions.
All right. Okay, so thanks again for letting me have the opportunity to present to discuss rather this paper. All right. So just to briefly recap what Chachi's doing here is we're discussing this relationship between social learning and the strength of communal ties using this interesting sort of natural experiment looking at soil heterogeneity, right? And this, of course, is a very difficult question with lots of endogeneity problems therein. So this is a very clever way of getting around that and exploring that causal relationship. Some of the things that Chachi finds are incredibly interesting. In particular, that soil heterogeneity has this effect on social learning, and that in turn has this effect on communal ties. And then these longer effects, in particular, really stood out to me as quite fascinating, right? That soil heterogeneity predicts these long run changes in social structure that are observable at the county level even today. Very, very cool paper. Like I said, I want to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to read it because I wasn't familiar with it. And as I said, give me some very interesting ideas for my own work. And this follows a sort of a long line of very recent papers that are looking at the natural environment, looking to the natural environment as a predictor for social structure and for local norms and institutions. It's quite polished as well, which of course, as a discussant is great. It's easy to read, but also makes it somewhat difficult to come up with substantive questions. Luckily, I was able to come up with a few that I think will be helpful as Chachi revises this paper and hopefully submits it somewhere very soon here. A lot of my comments here, my main comments rather, are going to focus on framing. I think careful framing can resolve the problems, the minor issues that I have with the paper. I'm going to focus on two sort of main comments, and both sort of address discrepancies between, I think, what the paper seeks to do, or sort of how it motivates itself, right? Which is to study this impact of social learning on the formation of communal ties, and what it actually does in practice, right? Which is to study how soil heterogeneity, how diversity in the natural environment affects cohesion in the social environment, right? This is the reduced form relationship that the paper focuses on is this latter one, but the motivation of the paper is very much about this relationship of social learning and close communities, and I think that discrepancy poses a few problems as the paper progresses, right? So I'm going to argue that soil heterogeneity rather affects communal ties through a variety of channels, not just social learning, and that's some careful reframing of this paper around social learning as a sort of key central mechanism will really put the cherry on top, make it ready for submission to a very, very solid journal. All right, so this first sort of alternative mechanism I'm going to focus a little bit on is a selective migration one. Of course, Chachi does a lot of work here to get at this. There's some very clever work that goes on here that I really like, and is inspired me to do some similar stuff in my own work. But I'm going to poke a couple holes in it. Right? So the author has this model in mind and the motivation of the paper, wherein soil homogeneity predicts more social learning activity, which in turn predicts stronger communal ties, right? And in particular, this is the relationship that the paper cares about. These latter two nodes describe the relationship of interest. And soil homogeneity is what sorts people into the treatment groups, right? So places with more soil homogeneity entail more social learning activity, which in turn affects communal ties. One problem with this, to me, is that it seems unlikely that migrants were as good as randomly assigned to homogeneous versus heterogeneous soil counties. right? With the social learning activities themselves being the sort of the sole source of these effects on communal ties. So I'm just going to give an example to sort of illustrate the potential problems there. So one idea is that independent of actual social learning activity here and its impact on social networks is that soil heterogeneity may attract sorting by those with a comparative advantage in working alone, right? So this is related to the mechanism, but it's independent of the actual social learning activity taking place. This, of course, may be correlated with less entry into social networks, right? To the extent that the people that have comparative advantages in working alone may enter differently into social networks. We call these introverts, right? Now, these introverts, importantly, may not be anti-social, right? So they may not be reflected by this name index that Chachi's using to look at these sorting effects, right? So they may, in fact, value community a lot, and they may name their kids things that are related to the names of the local community. So they may not be captured in this exercise, but they may nonetheless enter into social networks differently. And if all the introverts are sorting into solo work environments and all the extroverts are sorting into teamwork environments where social learning is taking place, this can have an effect on the outcome independent of the actual treatment going on. So that's just one example of how sorting could still be playing into this. Another thing I'm going to look at or sort of use to motivate a little bit of a tiny hole I'll poke in the story is this long run exercise, which is very cool, but poses a bit of a problem for the motivation of the paper. In particular, if places with soil heterogeneity entail these sort of weaker long run binding moral values, right? Let's say you have a meaner people in places that have soil heterogeneity. Naturally, when people move to these places, they're going to develop weaker social ties than they had before because the people are mean, right? Independent of the actual social learning activity going on. There's a culture that forms in these places that is driving the effect eventually, independent of the actual social learning. Of course, there's also things that might be driving this meanness, this long run culture. And these places, for example, if places with homogeneous soil entail more interaction or more stuff to talk about, bond over outside of work. For instance, the crops are great this year, or the crops are bad this year. And then this might also feed into this culture. So I guess one could say that there's just a lot of different forces. One could argue are shaping social cohesion in these places that precedes the migration of folks into these places and potentially shapes their ability to desire and fit in after they migrate. So the bottom line here is I think that there are a lot of sort of pro-social forces that soil homogeneity seems to entail that drives these long-run network effects. And I think that the overall story is incredibly interesting. I think the framing is just a little bit tricky in terms of sort of framing this as a causal story of social learning on social networks when social learning is really just a central mechanism among other maybe social pro-social forces that are driving this relationship between soil and social networks. Yeah, so that's the bulk of my comments, right? So it's, again, these aren't problems in terms of the identification or the data work. It's all very, very well done. It's a fantastically written paper with a lot of really, really interesting analysis. I think just with some very careful reframing, this can become a very, very top-notch paper in no time. I have a couple other minor comments that I'll blaze over here, and I'll let Chachi's read these. I've just sent him the slides, so he'll have a chance to look over these a little bit more, but give you guys all a chance to engage in some Q&A. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Chachi.
Thanks so much for those comments. Can you come up to the microphone?
Well, this is an interesting paper, and it's not a teacher's topic. I have a couple of questions.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question.
Is it not on? Can you come up here? Oh, okay. It's quite annoying. So this is an interesting paper on a topic that I think is an important one. I have some questions. One is this notion of soil heterogeneity. It'd be important to know just how critical it was for output in terms of income, production per acre, and so forth. It just isn't obvious to me that soil heterogeneity have been that important within the small areas that it's looking at, but it may have been relative to other factors that may have been critical. Another point is that there's an additional literature that looks at small group collective action and so forth, and that is associated with Eleanor Ostrom. And one of the key findings that she has across a variety of settings is that these kinds of collective action or social cohesion measures and so forth depend importantly on limited entry and exit in groups, and that the groups have to be relatively small. And that isn't my understanding of the agricultural frontier, especially that one associated with Fred Shannon and other agricultural historians. There was a lot of migration in and a lot of migration out. And so I think it would be important to know more about the nature of these communities and whether or not these communities somehow had less in and out migration than other places. It would be also useful to compare similar places that did not have this social cohesion, according to the measure he has here, in terms, again, outcomes, income per capita, productivity per acre, and so forth, to see just how important this social cohesion measure was. Finally, getting back to this information problem, it would seem that distance for migrants would be very important. And that is, if you migrate from Ohio to Nebraska, that's one thing. If you migrate from Ohio to Illinois, that's another thing. And so it seems in terms of the information problem. So it would seem like having more information about how far migrants or immigrants had to travel when they moved to these areas would also be critical in terms of understanding the information problem, and also how sharing information within a small group could be helpful.
So
Would you like to respond? Another question. So do you want to give a response?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should I'll respond to a few things and then take more questions. So first of all, thanks, Patrick, for the discussion. Thank you so much. One point that I want to say is that social cohesion and close-knit social structures are related terms, but they're not the same. Sort of, you can have a society where the social cohesion is quite high, but the strength of the intensity of social ties are quite loose and vice versa. So and I think those terms are causing some confusion. Also, when you think about in-group cooperation, so for example, some institutions that sort of in which farmers can cooperate in, such as big national farmers alliances or the cooperative movements. There oftentimes are substitution, they're substituting. I'm sorry. There are substitutes of informal things that happen within the community. So I just don't know if I agree regarding those expectations of what kind of relationship we should expect to find.
I think we have one more question. I have another question.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Can you on Zoom hear me, or is it hard? Yeah, okay. Maybe not. Okay. Hi, this is Laura from the University of Arizona, and I thought it was a very interesting paper. Just a couple very quick comments. Spatially, I'm just curious if maybe a different spatial metric might be helpful. Like the counties can be very large, and maybe heterogeneity within like a very big county is not as helpful as like heterogeneity within a township, or like just something smaller like that. And in terms of just the cultural ties, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about how some of the agrarian cultural communities that are there, like Mormon farming communities, there are a lot of tribal lands here. Some have farms, some don't, or maybe playing into some of your findings. And then I don't know if I missed it in the presentation, but a little more discussion on what you mean by soil heterogeneity would be great, because it could mean a lot of things. And as it was mentioned, maybe there's a better metric. Thanks.
All right. Did you want to respond in 30 seconds?
Yeah, I will. So thanks. Interesting points. So I'll just say one thing that relates to two points. So the way the soil heterogeneity index is calculated is just using soil taxonomy that classify soil into different types in the taxonomy, and so that's done at a very, very small scale for very fine grid, looking just at the local heterogeneity at points around you, and then just average within a county. So it's immune to county sizes. There's no clear relationship between county size and the local.
So thanks so much. Let's give a round of applause. All right, so we're pleased to have Aparna Howlader speaking on collective action under climate shock. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. And my paper will also be on soil, on cultivation, on learning. So I think Raj already set the scenario for me. So I will start. I'm primarily an environmental economist, so I will start with something environmental. This is the current soil degradation index in the whole world. So you can see it's pretty bad everywhere. And if we want to understand how we can reduce this soil erosion, then the most popular activities that people do to conserve land, primarily agricultural land, those have been divided into kind of three parts, we can say. The first one is land conversion, which means taking land out of intensive use. And then working land conservation, which means giving incentives to farmers to protect their land or soil. And then a combination of different kind of policies to define property right. Now, these policies together or individually, they can have different unintended consequences given your pre-existing land use too. So my research is in this intersection, that how does land conservation policies and local institutions affect economic development, and what we can learn from historical context. The reason I am using historical context because local institutions and land conservation policies take a very long time to have any effect. So going back to the research context, I am using USA Dust Bowl as my primary data source and to understand the institutional framework related to soil. So after the Dust Bowl in 1930s, priority in agricultural policies changed from intensive land use. And it's important for us to understand the consequence of those policies. Now, if some of you are not familiar with Dust Bowl, Professor Rhode is here. So this is what Dust Bowl looked like in 1930. The main reason was continuous drought for almost 10 years. There was a huge amount of destruction of grassland from late 19th century. So soil started to blow away with wind, which is what you are seeing in the map. Soil erosion level was really high, and dust even crossed to the east coast. So at the beginning, the policy was to teach farmers by demonstration plot and also to give farmers financial incentives in the first New Deal, under the first New Deal. Then in 1937, under the second New Deal, USDA gave different kind of incentives to farmers to create a local institution that still is the primary unit of soil conservation in the whole USA. The name is Soil Conservation Districts. In most part, it's named Soil Conservation Districts. In some parts, it's named Natural Resource Conservation Districts too. So it's important because this institution has been there almost for now 80 years. And it's important for us to understand what happened, what made people to form this local institution, and how those local institutions have worked with farmers. This is the Great Plains. So this is my study area. And this is the Great Plains soil erosion level in 1934. So you can see mostly it was really high. This was the USDA budget for farmland conservation. Now you can see if you can see my mouse, this line, this kind of blue line, this is the line that we are following. So you can see the policy is still here under different names, but the policy to help farmers with different assistance and made this local institution is still there. Now, if we look back to the broad picture of our research question, that how does this local institution help communities to be climate resilient and how climate shock affect this local institution formation? So local institution by definition is a set of rules and norms that reduce transaction cost, and my discussant, Professor Eric Edwards, have lots of papers on groundwater irrigation. There are papers on community forest user groups too. So in my research, I'm taking another example. Now, I'm following mostly 4 types of literature. One is definitely at the beginning, there were tragedy of commons, and then property right literature is there. Now, next literature, what Elinor Ostrom and lots of our co-authors have worked on, that how local institutions can play a major role in coordinating natural resource management. Other than this CPR management literature, I'm also trying to contribute in the New Deal literature that has been mostly compiling the new database to understand what happened from 1930 in the New Deal. So in this paper, I will use a duration model to understand the formation, and then I will use a difference in difference framework to understand the climate resilience. Primary data creation, I will show you in a little bit. Background, again, I think mostly you know already these things, but to say again just this point that the reason was, as Raj also said, farmers were very independent-minded in the Great Plains, and USDA was struggling to communicate with farmers. So that's why Hugh Bennett, at that time, the soil conservation scientist in USDA, he thought that giving power to the farmers' own local institution will really help. So it started from 1936. In 1957, almost all counties in the Great Plains had soil conservation districts. And mostly now, every county has one soil conservation district. This is the timeline. So Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act that we know as Second New Deal. And these are the states that I'm following. Data construction, I want to show you a little bit the kind of primary data construction I did from the National Archives. This is for one specific county that I just randomly took. This is in Oklahoma, Atoka County. So you can see this is how the Soil Conservation District's annual reports are there in the College Park National Archives, and we can see what they have been doing, what kind of educational activities they have been doing with farmers to teach them. We can see the conservation activities too by long-term and short-term conservation activities. So at first, I will take the formation timing to understand what really affected the formation timing, and then I will use the conservation activities database to understand if these conservation activities helped farmers to be more resilient to the next climate shock. Main structural changes, the kind of structural change that we know about soil conservation activities like tree plantation, farmland drainage occurred. And short-term activities included crop rotation, contour farming, cover cropping, etc. So now, this was the primary way to teach farmers that happened from 1936. It was the soil conservation demonstration plots. I collected this map also from the National Archives, and I digitalized it. I digitalized only for the Great Plains area and the adjacent some states, because those are just too close for some of my counties. These are the variables that I'm using in the duration analysis to understand the formation. So some of these databases have been collected from others' papers. I took Hornbeck Soil Erosion Index. I took New Deal expenditure from Price Fishback. Empirical strategy, I will follow a duration model, a different kind of duration models to check And we are interested to understand the effects of different economic and ecological covariates on the creation of the soil conservation district. I will do different kind of modeling just to check if my results are consistent. As we know, this is the duration model. Duration model is basically a logic model where your outcome variable is in time. That's what we have here. So as we can see at the beginning, this was the formation timing for the Great Plains Soil Conservation District. I want to mention here that I'm using only 8 states. I couldn't use Texas and Colorado, probably Colorado, yeah, because National Archives is not open. So this is the variation across the states, and we can see there is a strong variation over state too. And we have to keep this in mind that different states had different opening date, different law passing date too. So if I go to the duration results, you can see demonstration plots by which farmers were learning conservation. That has a huge impact on the formation. Compared to the people who do not live around demonstration plot, it's almost 48% higher. We can also see the erosion level. Higher erosion level has also a huge impact on the formation of the soil conservation districts. Interestingly, we do not see I didn't put the result here, but we did not see any kind of impact from irrigated acre. So irrigation at this point of time did not have any effect on the formation of the soil conservation districts. But we can see theoretically consistent results for tenants. We can see how New Deal expenditure, the financial incentive to the farmers, how that affected the soil conservation district. That is also very high. And I also use the land-grant universities because extension service really helped farmers to understand the importance of soil conservation, and that we can see that also had a huge impact on the formation. Now, this is just another model, Cox proportional hazard model. The results are pretty similar. The magnitudes are different, but consistent with the other model. In the paper, I have different other models too, just to show it. One thing to mention here that I have created a monthly rainfall database too to see if rainfall shock has any impact. But monthly rainfall shock, when I match that with monthly formation data, I do not see any impact, which probably is just a lag effect. Now, which is what I'm saying here. Now, from this duration framework, my main takeaway is initial erosion level affects the speed of formation. Demonstration plots helped to create soil conservation district, which could both of these could be really important for lots of developing countries now who are trying to create soil conservation learning programs. And then we also see that access to land-grant universities extension service helped the creation. Also, the New Deal, interesting thing to remember that the financial incentives from the New Deal also had a huge positive impact on the formation. The next set of the paper is about how this formation in the later part, if you already have a soil conservation district, how that helped you to be climate resilient. So this you already know. Mostly I just want to focus on my outcome variable here is coming from the county level land value and county level agricultural revenue from annual crop level database. And my soil conservation activities is the annual reports from soil conservation districts. That's by year. We have from 1936 to 1959. And I have used some part of the educational reports from extension service too. I have created the climate variable from precipitation and temperature from PRISM database. Up until now, that's my climate variable, and it's a monthly average. This is a very initial framework for me. I just started to see what happens, and my This is basically a difference in difference framework where I am interacting climate shock with my conservation activities to see it's a lawn panel lawn difference model to see how these conservation activities affected the climate resilience, affected the crop yield and crop revenue under next climate shock. So I'm interested in this beta 3, and this is a very preliminary result for me. So you can see if I create extreme temperature exposure that I created from shock variable. So I am using land value and agricultural revenue. You can see that the if there is high temperature exposure, soil conservation activities help communities to have higher revenue. Now, this is very preliminary results, so I'm not saying a lot about it, but this is something I'm trying to explore now that if I should try instrumental variable coming from the demonstration plot distance, because demonstration plots, the placement of the demonstration plots for a farmer were mostly not really endogenous. So I'm trying to see if demonstration plot could be used as a instrumental variable here too. And I want to know whatever you guys think. I think I am out of time too.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Please stop sharing.
Pleased to have Eric Edwards from NC State providing commentary. Take it away, please.
All right, thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Sorry I can't join you all in person. So let's just get into it. You know, the context, as probably everyone here knows, for the paper is that we have these big droughts and sort of in the Great Plains, lesser known drought in the 1890s of similar magnitude and very large effects, and then the Dust Bowl in the 1930s with these large consequences. And then later, we also have droughts, right, in the 50s and the 70s, and maybe don't see as much of these sort of upheavals like we see with the Dust Bowl. So I think it's really important to remember that, you know, the Dust Bowl is special, but it's not that special. So we need to understand what about it makes it special, and what, you know, these soil conservation districts that emerge after it, sort of in that context. Why didn't they emerge in the 1890s? Why did they emerge just in the 1930s? And that's important when we think about, you know, where they're going to emerge and why. So the present paper has a really nice data collection effort. I thought, you know, that was illustrated by showing us the forms that were gathered from the archives. I think that's terrific. There's a lot of information there. I don't know how much that information is making it into the paper yet, but I would say that more maybe would improve things, and we'll talk about that. Then the paper links to the role of local common pool resource management. You know, the work of Eleanor Ostrom, again, not as mentioned as much in the paper as maybe it could be. And then I think importantly, there's a lot of discussion in the paper on the federal government and the role of the federal government in these soil conservation districts. And I think that's important, and that's a key here, is that this is not like what we think of ground up local collective action to form soil conservation districts. This is top down government trying to get people doing certain practices. So what I want to discuss today is 3 areas from this paper. The first is, you know, the benefits of adopting soil conservation districts and why they differ across counties. I think the paper could do a much better job of laying these out. Then the role of transaction costs and how the users in these counties, what transaction costs they face in forming these local districts, and whether those are important. And both of these aspects, both the benefits and the costs, should inform the model this duration model of when and how long it takes for districts to form. And then finally, the framing of climate uncertainty and local collective action. I'm going to speak to that briefly as well. So my favorite line from the paper is here, and that's that the soil conservation district only forms when collective action will give more aggregate benefit than the private action undertaken by individual farmers. So I think this is a wise way to think about this, but I think the paper needs to do a much better job of laying out what the benefits of collective action are. So I have some questions here. Past erosion predicts soil conservation district formation. Do these high erosion areas benefit more from these districts? For the demonstration plots, this is more suggestive of a story of technology or policy diffusion, and so it'd be interesting to link that to the dates when they were formed to see if there's a relationship there. And then there's some sort of claims made in the paper that wheat or cotton makes lower district formation, more area and farms makes lower district formation. I want to know why. How does this affect the benefits or the costs of the users who are forming these districts? And then there's a large discussion of the share of tenants. This is super interesting. It seems like a really strong result. I think it might be worthwhile, and I don't know this that well, but it might be worthwhile to ensure that tenants, it's claims in the paper that tenants can't vote. I would ensure that's true in all the states. Some states had tenants voting, some states didn't. If tenants can vote, that would be a much stronger intuitive explanation for why areas with large tenants don't have conservation districts. Now to transaction costs. And it's nice to see Gary Leibkap ask a question last session, so he's in the audience. I can bring up these transaction costs in the formation of these districts. I would look at informational problems, heterogeneity in the resource, number of bargaining parties, and heterogeneity in the bargaining parties as key determinants of transaction costs in forming districts, right? And so I have some notes here. Number of landowners, different soil, crops, irrigation can create heterogeneity and make it more difficult for people to reach an agreement on these sorts of districts. And there's a lot in here about information. And Gary has some great work on private or asymmetric information, creating difficulties in negotiation over these sorts of problems. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the framing, because the paper is really framed around climate change, and it wasn't discussed as much here, but I've heard a lot of things on this. Essentially, can local collective action help us address the effects of climate change? And what Ostrom said, and other authors have reiterated, is that management systems should be scaled to the problems they are solving. And in this view, the role of the central government, federal government or state governments, both are involved here, is some facilitation of local action. And one way to do that is by creating laws and taxing authorities and things like that lower transaction costs and make it easier for groups to do this. And so I'm going to skip the next point for now, and I want to go down to what I think might be sort of a different way of framing the paper. And the paper is sort of right now kind of generally framed around why do these districts emerge and climate uncertainty and things like that. I think there's something about the Dust Bowl providing some sort of shock. For instance, some areas get a lot of dust erosion, some areas don't. And that can spur action. And there's some literature on this, because these shocks affect both the perceived benefits to the users, right? If I'm in a high Dust Bowl county, or a high dust erosion county, I perceive that I may need to do this quicker, or it can lower transaction costs, right? For one way to do that is by aligning the information of all the users in the region. So I have one last slide I want to close with, and that's sort of this broader question that I think emerged from this paper. And I don't know if this is a follow-on paper or what, but I really got curious whether the soil conservation districts did anything and whether we can measure what they did, and sort of thinking about these benefits, users would engage in collective action if the benefits are high and the costs are low, right? What are the benefits, and can we prove that or show that these users saw benefits over time? So with that, at 0 minutes, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take questions. And so you can come to the mic. Here. And flip. Would you like to respond?
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks a lot for all these comments and suggestions. I think it was a great discussion. I don't have lots of answers now. I will have to think how to deal with suggestions that you made. Just one point that I think the reason in 1890s it didn't happen. It happened in 1937. I think it's mainly because it was federally backed and federal government didn't start to think about soil conservation that much before the Dust Bowl. And it's pretty much sure that tenants cannot vote. It's only the landowners. So in my mind, I think that the reason why percentage of tenants have a negative effect on the formation in all kind of models, it's because there could be different, there were a huge amount of absentee landowners too. So if there is a higher amount of tenants and there are not enough landowners, so the formation could be delayed. Otherwise, thank you, Erin, and I will probably ask you for the slides later. Thanks.
Let's give a round of applause. Thanks so much. So we are now pleased to have Mindy Miller speaking on a new institutional history of allotment. From the Zoom, Can you see it on Zoom?
No.
Mute yourself and then.
Mute myself. Yes, thank you. This happened when I was sharing Paul's session yesterday. I also was not good at sharing the slides with Zoom.
This is not retaliation. This is simply a continuation. So this is working now.
All right, can everyone in this room hear me? Can people on Zoom hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Everyone here and on Zoom can see things? All right, perfect. All right, well, thank you all for being here. This is joint work with Matt Gregg, who's at the Minneapolis Fed, and as always, nothing I say represents the views of the Fed. So this paper we're going to talk about today is what we're calling a new institutional history of allotment. Many people in the room probably know what allotment is. If you don't, allotment was federal policy towards American Indians from 1887 with the passage of the General Allotment Act until 1934 with the passage of the Wheeler-Howard Act. The idea of allotment was to transition federal Indian policy from isolation or containment of the Indian population on reservations to instead incorporation or assimilation into the general American population. And the way this was going to happen is that individual citizens or members of a tribe would be given an amount of land, what is called an allotment. Remaining land, which is called surplus land, would then be opened up for sale, largely to, or with the goal of sale to the white population. The allotments would then be held in trust by the federal government for a certain amount of years, which meant that land could not be sold. Right? Eventually, the policy changed to allow certain people to have their land converted to fee. So in essence, the bundle of property rights that we associate with normal land ownership. A precondition for this to occur was often, but not always, that the Indian be declared competent. What exactly that means is a question in and of itself. But in general, the idea said that the people were competent to handle their own affairs. So what we want to do is get a better understanding of the dynamics of allotment, right? What happens on the ground, what happened to individuals at a more micro level. Right? Allotment has been extensively studied and written about, including by Dustin, my discussant, and his co-author, Christian Dipple. But there's a lot of uncertainty about kind of what exactly happened when to different people. Right? And this paper is going to bring together some very fine-grained detail on the Pine Ridge Reservation to better understand what happens. There's a sense, the first note here is this is an economic history paper, and this is an economic history paper of the old school. Right, where we're trying to just understand things, establish facts, gather data to see what we know. It is not, I would say, an economic history paper of the new school where we're going to try to have an identification strategy where we're making causal claims. I will show you regressions. They will be correlations. I will not have an identification strategy. So don't ask me about an instrument or anything like that, because that's not what we're doing here. Right? So it's a different style of paper. Right? We do this by digitizing a lot of records generated by the Office of Indian Affairs. That's the precursor to the BIA on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So we digitize and geocode land records, banking records, and census-like records for about 8,000 individuals on Pine Ridge from 1904 to 1924. So we know where somebody lives, that is where their allotment was. We know their land quality from taking the allotment map and overlaying it with modern soil quality maps. We know if their land was taken out of trust, that is converted to fee simple ownership. For a subset of people whose land was taken out of trust, we know for how much that land was then sold for. We could use banking records for people on the Pine Ridge Reservation to observe the flow of money into and out of their individual bank accounts. So we could see, for example, exactly how much of a shock a land sale was for an individual's wealth and income levels. We also have a census level, a reservation level census taken in 1924 for a subset of the population that looks fairly representative to us. That gives us additional information about people. Not in this paper, but we've also recently digitized, but are still cleaning a 1940 census of everyone on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and also very detailed economic and income data that will eventually be brought into this project. And our goal here, what's helpful for us, is that for whatever reason, the agents on Pine Ridge were very careful at putting allotment numbers on everything they did. So we could link people across time. So we could link people from 1904, for example, to 1940 with these allotment numbers. So linkage in this paper is not probabilistic matching. Linkage in this paper is just, it's an administrative task, right? It's just following these numbers across time, which is very useful for being able to understand the effect of what's happening with individuals after their land is allotted. Did that move for Zoom and everyone? All right, so what are we going to do with
No,
this?
I don't think the Zoom slides are changing.
I suspected that would be the case. Just the first one? You don't see that?
It's stuck on the overview slide.
We're on the overview. Did you see this slide?
No.
Okay. There is zero learning by doing when it comes to me and Zoom slides here. I've done this like 7 times now, I think.
We are taking a technical interlude.
The slide just changed.
Oh, this is better. Yeah, press down.
Oh, hey, Peter. And can everybody in the room see that okay now? Is it worth, okay.
It's still only overview. Can you change the slide?
We're on the overview slide.
Yeah, good.
Second overview? Okay, great. All right. So what do? So we take these kind of underutilized data sets that have been in the National Archives, and we develop a set of stylized facts about what happened on allotment in the Pine Ridge Reservation. Some of these facts are corrective. That is, we're finding things that are different than what is previously believed. Some are corroborative. That is, what previous literature has found, we also find. All right, one thing we have found, for example, is that land with the highest soil quality was not necessarily removed from allotment and held as surplus land. This is in contrast to a belief that the best land on reservations had been held aside for whites. We won't go into this in today's discussion. I could tell you more about that afterwards if you have questions. We also find that the land marketed by the Indian Office, that is land that was sold on the Indian Office on behalf of individuals, was often sold as a discount relative to land off the reservation of comparable soil quality. Right? So that is, it looks like these sale prices here were less than they might have been if the land was off the reservation. We find, and this was a little surprising, that to me at least, the income shock of a land sale wasn't actually huge for an individual. It was actually comparable to the income shock of allotment benefits that people received, and to a lesser extent, the income shock of annuities that people received from the federal government. The payments were distributed to allottees by the Indian agents fairly slowly. So there actually wasn't a huge, I think we have a perception that people's land was sold, they get a chunk of money, they'd spend it very quickly. That's not what we see happening on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Another thing we find is there's I think a stylized fact or a belief that a lot of land by American Indians was lost after allotment and then patenting due to foreclosure from property taxes. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, many of the areas were in unincorporated counties that had no property taxes, and that didn't prevent people from losing their land. Right? So the property tax as a mechanism for losing land doesn't seem to be the case here necessarily. We also look at who had their land converted from trust to fee, and we find kind of positive selection on characteristics, which is corroborative of the literature that found things like, say, education or literacy were correlated with having your land converted. All right, so that's generally what we find. Let me give you a little bit of background on Pine Ridge. I'll go into the data more and then talk through some of these findings in depth. All right, page. All right, so why are we studying Pine Ridge Reservation? There's several reasons we do this. So one is Pine Ridge is fairly representative of allotment on a large reservation in the West. Right? Many people there did not study did not support allotment. Allotment starts in a time period that's fairly typical in the early 1900s. Allotments were taken out of trust through a variety of different methods, which introduces an interesting variation if one wanted to do causal analysis. The feed patenting here occurs between 1917 largely and 1920, which is an agricultural boom, which is something we see on other reservations too. And by 1930, when allotment ends, the reservation is a mix of land, which is something that's common in many areas. The Sioux, as some people may know, were not traditionally farmers. They relied more on buffalo, right? Which is another aspect of reservation, the idea of allotment, the idea of converting people from more nomadic lifestyles to settled farming lifestyles. And also, as I mentioned, we have this interesting difference in organization of counties, where sometimes people had to pay property taxes and sometimes they didn't. Another reason we study Pine Ridge is that the Sioux have often been called the archetypical tribe in the American imagination. There's a sense where the attention paid to the Sioux is very big. And Pine Ridge is also today emblematic of the economic problems that many reservations face. So there's high rates of poverty and unemployment. Estimates vary a little bit, but think of unemployment rates of about 20%, poverty rates of 50% or so. Is that 10 or 5? Oh my goodness. Okay. So there's low life expectancies, significant health challenges, there's low levels of educational attainment, and there's a sense that a lot of these problems have their origins in allotment. For example, 67% of agricultural revenue on the reservation goes to non-natives, for only 8% of the population. Right? So why do we care about this? We're all economic historians. We know the literature. It's land reform, privatization issues, methods of transfer. Okay. All right, so let me tell you more about Pine Ridge itself. All right, so the Pine Ridge Agency was formed in 1878. And in 1889, the Pine Ridge Reservation itself was established. Right? In 1891, the federal government changes laws to allow the leasing of land on reservations. And in the background of all these federal policies, what happens uniquely on Pine Ridge is in 1874, gold is found in the Black Hills. As often happens when gold is found on land that is claimed by Native Americans, people want to take their land. We see military conflict in 1876 through 1877. That's the Battle of Little Bighorn. In 1889, when the reservation is split, this is very controversial. And we see in this time period, the federal government kills Sitting Bull, and we also have the massacre of Wounded Knee during this time period. So if you've heard of these things, this is the reservation that I'm talking about here. In 1904, allotment starts on the reservation. In 1906, the federal government changes the policy to allow land to be transferred out of trust into fee simple patenting. In 1907, essentially the federal government says that they can sell the trust land of people who are non-competent allottees, which is a new change. And then in 1910, they changed the way they deal with land that is inherited by people on the reservation. Skipping over that just for time's sake. All right, so what's our data? So this is what the allotment maps look like for Pine Ridge. There are detailed allotment maps that have everybody's allotment number. We overlay these using GIS, match it to soil quality, and we end up with something that looks like this, where we have every allotment on the Pine Ridge Reservation. We know who owns each allotment. We know where the surplus land that was purchased by whites were. And then there were black tracts here that were reserved for either the main agency and boarding schools, kind of other Office of Indian Affairs things, schools, churches, and timber reserves. We connect all this land data to these allotment cards, patenting records, the 1924 survey, land sales from 1914 to 1919, and the banking records. And what this allows us to do to see what exactly happened during this allotment period on Pine Ridge Reservation. So here, for example, we can see exactly how much land was allotted over time at the household level. Right. So you see, for example, allotment starts here in 1904. When allotment occurred on the Pine Ridge Reservation, each family head would receive 320 acres. A single person would receive 160 acres. Children would receive 80 acres. People who had land that wasn't very good, grazing land, would receive double that amount. And so we could see here this distribution of acreages. Right. Over time, we can see that the acreages are converted to patents in fee. Right. There's a peak of this in 1920, after which the federal government restricts conversion and the amount falls dramatically. What do we know about land sales? Paul, how much time do I have? A minute? Okay. All right, so what do we know about land sales on the Pine Ridge Reservation? We have these sales of 200 people who were non-competent. The federal government decided for whatever reason their land needed to be sold to get access to money. Right? This is a comparison between people who, we have information on land prices and people who don't. They look like they're roughly comparable groups. Right? When we look at what these lands sold for and compare it using agricultural census data for the rest of Southwest Dakota, we see that land sales in Southwest and the Pine Ridge Reservation were sold at values per acre much less than land in the rest of Southwest Dakota. So this is in the U.S. We're restricting ourselves to the situation of Southwest Dakota here, which might not be ideal. What's going on there? Well, it looks in general that the return to land quality is much lower on Pine Ridge. So this is looking at the determinants of land value on Pine Ridge. Pay attention to that top row there of soil quality. We then just compare to other parts of the US, and we see that the return on soil quality seems to be lower here for whatever reason. The Indian agents report that they had difficulty selling land on the reservation itself, which may be part of why we see this explanation. Right? How much of a shock was getting one of these land sales? Well, the land sales themselves, we do a kind of an event study, estimating equation. Let me show you the results here. So a land sale on average increased someone's bank balance by around $300. And even though there's this big initial shock, the money is taken out of the accounts fairly slowly. All right, and that's in part because the Indian agents are the ones that have to decide whether taking the money out of the account is worth it. So individuals don't have the ability to do this on their own. This actually is roughly comparable to the amount of money that people receive for allotment benefits. So everybody who had an allotment received an allotment benefit. The land shocks weren't that much bigger than the allotment benefits. They weren't a dramatic difference for people compared to what they received pre-land sale. Right. These are the people who received money out of trust. And this amount is smaller, but again, it's not dramatically smaller relative to what's happening with land sales. And this is lease revenue, which is a little bit lower again, right? But it does look like these land sale shocks, they're not huge. All right. The next thing we do is look to see whose land was patented in fee. And what we find in essence, if we look at this, we'll do a quick regression here, is land was patented in fee for people that seem to have at least characteristics that Indian agents would view as being more competent. So more likely to have schooling, people who were of mixed blood were more likely to have their land patented in fee. There are also people who are more likely to own livestock, right? And this is very comparable to what we observe in general in the literature. All right, so I'm at time, but those are my stylized facts.
Okay, we're pleased to have Dustin Fry give him.
What is the, to get it to full screen, what's the hotkey on a, is it F5? All right, we'll just do it that way. All right, perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Mindy, for kind of the rundown of the paper. I think this is a really excellent project. It is starting, as Mindy mentioned, right? It's starting to kind of unpack a lot of what we we know about allotment. So much of kind of the literature here in terms of this process comes through, kind of these fragments of sort of agent biographies, kind of letters, anecdotes that come in from sort of the field, or these Office of Indian Affairs annual reports. And, in some sense, for sort of both kind of 1 and 2 off this list, right, they're both basically put together by, kind of the agent, by the bureaucrat. And this, I've always kind of read these where this group is kind of the heroes of their own story out on the frontier, where they're very much writing about, their successes and how well it's going, and everything about sort of the narrative that they paint is kind of sort of shines a pretty good light on kind of how they're doing. And so I think it's, to be able to find kind of data and to be able to contribute to this, where we get to kind of actually see in a more kind of granular way, like how is allotment rolling out? How is this sort of being handled kind of with this nice sort of time flow, is a really valuable contribution here. And I think in terms of just the data that they have, right, bringing in this banking data is really, really interesting, because we actually get to see sort of the transactions that hit, right? Some of these Office of Indian Affairs reports, right, they'll tell us kind of in this big picture about land sales. They give us these sort of overarching, kind of sales values, leasing values. And so it's really interesting to and I think this comment will come back a little bit later, but to kind of draw these comparisons between kind of what the Office of Indian Affairs and really kind of what the agents themselves are sort of sending to Washington or sort of reporting back, as kind of what's happening and how conditions are going compared to sort of what we actually see in the field. And so actually, I'm really excited to see kind of everything that this banking data unlocks, especially as we kind of see and as they build kind of additional layers of data as we go. And so, bringing that in is really nice. Adding these waves of the reservation census, which it sounds like maybe are a little different than the Indian census rolls. It sounds like there may be some more economic information in there, which is really nice. And then, the amazing feature of Pine Ridge is this, there's an incredible map that has survived that Mindy showed that sort of small inset picture to, which has kind of the name and number, which allows them to really geolocate parcels in a special way, right? And I think the two findings then that the paper contributes by bringing all this data is we get a much better sense of kind of the selection process, and probably most importantly, kind of seeing these payment flows, understanding how these payments are allocated over time, just the size of these payments. I think this is a really nice kind of contribution. So I have kind of three comments, sort of families of comments, I guess, in that I think as they're pushing this forward that I wanted to see. And so one, given the kind of nature of the data, it strikes me that they observe a lot about families. And so one of the things I was kind of curious about is whether or not we see kind of these, family level decision making, right? Do we see allotments kind of near, sort of clustered together in some ways, right? There was talk of, kind of the average household's allocation of an allotment. Because, adults and children, right? Everybody that was kind of eligible at the time of allotment received a patent. So the question was, do we see these together? Anecdotally, right? You'll hear some stories where, the child's patent, especially if it's a much younger child that is allotted sort of in a later iteration of the patenting process or the allotment process, right? That this sort of parcel, this 80 acres that would have gone to a child, is set really far away. Right. And then that just overall kind of changes the utility of the land, but it also may change sort of from a family's perspective, right? How do they think about these sort of family level decisions on kind of the patenting and sort of fee patenting process, right? Do you see adults, maybe the adult is sort of set as competent, or kind of the agent deems them competent in a way that they receive that fee patent, they sell that asset and then move to the child's, parcel sort of elsewhere. And you can imagine this within kind of a nuclear family structure or even at the extended family structure. So I think, kind of the focus in this data, it seems like would allow you to see some of this. There was a feature in the original act about for individuals that didn't kind of line up to get their allotments, right? They were, I think and it's again, how it's written sort of in the law versus how it's applied on the ground could be different, but there was about a 4-year period where you were supposed to sort of take an allotment, and those that didn't opt into an allotment had one assigned to them. So I was kind of wondering if you could see these sort of non-compliers and have a sense for, even just selection differences by this group, what happens to that, kind of what I'm sort of referring to as a non-complier. And then kind of on the selection front, soil quality, I think is helpful, but I know in work that is in a little bit of a more modern space with Christian and then Brian Leonard, right? We include a bunch of other characteristics that you can kind of match to the parcels themselves, right? Elevation, ruggedness, proximity to water, which there was a map in the slides you sent that showed sort of the encampments on Pine Ridge and how they really were just kind of anchored right down these streams, right? There was this sort of set of rivers or streams that were coming through, and all of the encampments were right along those, and so they would have had, this was sort of like a pre-allotment kind of locations, and so it struck me that those seem to be very important. And then also proximity to the border feels like, especially when we look at that Pine Ridge map, right? I think it's the bottom right-hand corner that's set aside for surplus land. Proximity to railroads, I'm not sure sort of where railroads are in this, sort of the proximity to those, whether they have any railroads running through Pine Ridge, or there was a file on historic trails that may have worked through there as well. So I think just a little bit more in this land quality space. The second big thing I wanted that I was really curious about are these agents themselves, right? And this is an area again where I think Christian and I have tried to make some investments to understanding these resident agents, right? They have a lot of control in the reservation in sort of lots of margins, right? They're looking over, kind of all of the allocation of kind of fulfilling federal obligations and treaties. They're maintaining apparently sort of they're assisting in the sort of sales leasing agreements, right? There's the competency piece. They're also in charge of the education side. And so, I had a long layover in Atlanta. And so I went through and kind of looked up the agents. You have John Brennan is sort of this initial agent in your period. He's like one of the founders of Rapid City. He's pushed out in 1917, according to his family papers. It was like a, sort of a political attack, and is replaced by Tidwell, right? And then there's sort of the fill-in between. But these agents, right? Brennan didn't, but some of these other agents were actually agents in other places, right? And so you can sort of potentially observe their behavior in other settings. I have kind of one more, but Minnie and I can talk about that later, and we can sort of open it up to the room. So thank you.
Does this work? I want to respond.
Those are all excellent comments. We should do all that.
Is there anybody online that has a question? Anybody in the room? Okay.
So my understanding is that this process led to land sales that were heavily discounted and therefore were detrimental to members of the reservation. Is your results confirming that this process leads to some sort of below market sale and ultimately lower welfare? Thanks.
Yeah, it is. So we definitely find that the land does seem to be sold for less than one would expect. At this point, we're not going to say why that is. We have some suspicions for why that is, but I definitely think that is something that we confirm, which is concerning.
Right, we have another question here.
I'm interested in mobility. Do the people who convert their land to fee simple move away from the reservation, or do they stay?
Okay, thank you. Well, this is a little out of left field, but I noticed that the discussion of the fee simple allotment and people selling their lands is really similar to what happened in late 18th century Spain, where some people were very terrified that everybody was selling their agricultural land and converting their inheritance to cash, because then when they moved to the city to try to make their fortune, they would squander the cash. But in retrospect, most people now say, well, that's great. People converted their land holdings to cash because that's where the economy was going. And I just wondered if you think about that, if anything comes to your mind.
Okay. Right side of the room, you're going to let the left side dominate in this way? Guess so.
So the mobility question is really interesting. Something we're interested in. We are trying to link some of the people. So to get at mobility, there's a few ways. We have this 1940 census that we recently collected, which we think will give us some data. But also then we need to link to the census itself. And so that's actually something we've been kind of playing around with to see what kind of matches we can get. There's not a large population of people that leave, say, South Dakota to go to other places. But within, we see some mobility.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause to the whole panel.